In the beginning there was the Word. But between the lines of that Word, in the shadows cast by sacred text, lie truths that have been deliberately obscured, systematically removed, and intentionally forgotten. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about the earliest days of humanity. This isn't speculation. This isn't fantasy. This is the recovered knowledge from ancient texts that the canonized Bible chose to exclude. Texts that reveal a cosmic drama far more complex and terrifying than Sunday school ever dared to teach. Today we pull back the veil on one of history's most suppressed mysteries. The beings who emerged from the void to help Cain, the first murderer, build the first city in the land of Nod. These weren't ordinary helpers. They weren't human. And their involvement in humanity's earliest civilization reveals a pattern that echoes through every major turning point in our hidden history. I'm your guide through the forbidden archives, and this is Godwin Scrolls, where we unearth the knowledge they don't want you to possess. If you're ready to see beyond the sanitized version of Scripture, to peer into the apocryphal texts and esoteric traditions that preserve what was deliberately erased, then take a breath. Steady yourself. Because once you understand what really happened in the land of Nod, you'll never read Genesis the same way again. Sound, deep resonant tone. Let's begin. Genesis chapter 4, verses 16 and 17. Read them slowly. Let each word settle into your consciousness. And Cain went out from the presence of the Lord, and dwelt in the land of Nod, on the east of Eden. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived, and bare Enoch. And he builded a city, and called the name of the city after the name of his son Enoch. 2 verses. 29 words in English. And yet, within these 2 verses lie questions that have haunted theologians, mystics, and seekers for millennia. Where did this city come from? How does a single exile, a fugitive and a vagabond as God himself declared Cain would be, suddenly possess the knowledge, the resources, and the manpower to build the world's first city? And perhaps most troubling of all, where did Cain's wife come from? The traditional answers are unsatisfying at best, intellectually dishonest at worst. There were other people, they say vaguely. Adam and Eve had other children. But this is theological hand-waving, a desperate attempt to patch over a narrative chasm that the canonized text deliberately created by removing the context. The apocryphal texts tell a very different story. According to the Book of Jubilees, a 2nd century BCE text revered by early Christians and still canonical in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, Cain didn't wander alone into empty wilderness. The land of Nod was already inhabited, but not by humans. At least not entirely. The name itself is revealing. Nod comes from the Hebrew root, nad, meaning to wander or to flee, but in ancient Sumerian and Akkadian contexts. This region east of Eden corresponds to territories described in much older flood narratives as dwelling places of the Watchers, those enigmatic beings described in the Book of Enoch who descended to earth with forbidden knowledge. Cain didn't stumble into empty desert. He walked into a realm where the barriers between the divine and material had already been breached, where beings of immense power and terrible wisdom had established their own civilizations, hidden from the eyes of the Edenic humans who still dwelt under God's direct presence. To understand who helped Cain, we must first understand who the Watchers were, and why their very existence was systematically erased from mainstream biblical teaching. The Book of Enoch, excluded from the Protestant and Catholic Bibles but preserved in Ethiopian Christianity and discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, provides explicit detail. In Enoch chapter 6, we read of 200 angels who descended to Mount Hermon, led by their chief Semyaza, during the days of Jared, which means descent, 5 generations after Adam. But here's where the chronology becomes crucial, and where mainstream scholarship deliberately obscures the timeline. According to the Book of Jubilees and careful chronological reconstruction from the genealogies, the Watchers' descent occurred significantly earlier than most assume, potentially overlapping with or even preceding Cain's exile. These weren't fallen angels in the simplified sense we've been taught. They were Watchers, celestial beings assigned to observe humanity but forbidden to interfere. Yet they looked upon the daughters of men and found them beautiful. They desired. And in that desire, they made a pact that would alter the trajectory of human history forever. But the daughters of men weren't their only interest. According to the expanded Enochian literature, particularly the Book of the Giants found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Watchers had a deeper agenda. They possessed knowledge, secrets of metalworking, astronomy, herbalism, warfare, cosmetics, sorcery, and most significantly, architecture and urban planning. They weren't just teaching humanity for romantic purposes. They were building something, establishing something, creating a rival civilization that would exist in parallel to the Adamic line that remained under divine authority. Now consider Cain's position. Marked by God, protected from human vengeance by a sevenfold curse upon anyone who would kill him, yet exiled from the presence of the divine. He was powerful yet isolated, protected yet cursed, human yet set apart. He was the perfect candidate for what the Watchers needed. A human with authority, independence from divine oversight, and the motivation to build something entirely new. A bridge between their realm and humanity's. A partner in their grand experiment. Let's address the question that exposes the entire narrative gap. Cain's wife. Where did she come from? The sanitized explanation, that she was a sister or niece from the Adamic line, creates more problems than it solves. If she was from Adam's family, why would she follow a marked murderer into exile? Why would she abandon the presence of God to dwell with the first criminal in history? The text suggests no reluctance, no divine intervention, no family drama. She simply exists, unnamed and unexplained. The Testament of Cain, a fragmentary Syriac text preserved in medieval manuscripts, offers a radically different account. It describes Cain's wife as Luluah, but identifies her not merely as a human woman but as someone born between the boundaries, a phrase that suggests hybrid origins. More explicitly, the Zohar and certain streams of Jewish mystical tradition identify Cain's wife as coming from the daughters of the Watchers, the first generation of hybrid beings born from the unions described in Genesis 6 verse 4, where the sons of God came unto the daughters of men and produced the Nephilim, the mighty men of old, men of renown. This completely reframes Cain's exile. He wasn't sent to empty wilderness to suffer alone. He was exiled into a realm where a parallel civilization was already forming, one populated by hybrids, by the offspring of angelic and human union, by beings who possessed both terrestrial and celestial attributes. And these beings recognized Cain immediately. Not as a criminal to be avoided, but as an opportunity. A human bearing the mark of divine protection, capable of bridging their world with humanity's, bearing the bloodline of Adam but cast out from Edenic authority. The ancient Armenian Apocrypha preserves a striking detail. When Cain arrived in Nod, he was greeted. There was a reception. The text describes luminous beings with faces like the sun, who approached him and offered alliance. These weren't demons in the medieval sense. They were the hybrid offspring of the Watchers, beautiful, powerful, knowledgeable, and hungry to expand their influence. Cain's wife wasn't just a woman. She was a treaty. A genetic and political alliance between the first human exile and the first hybrid civilization. Now we arrive at the centerpiece of our investigation, the city itself. Genesis tells us Cain builded a city. In the original Hebrew, the verb is bana, not simply to construct, but to establish, to found with intention and permanence. This wasn't a village or encampment. It was an ayar, a fortified urban center with walls, gates, and organized society. Archaeological evidence suggests that the earliest cities in human history, Uruk, Eridu, Jericho, required sophisticated knowledge of astronomy for orientation, mathematics for planning, metallurgy for tools, and social organization far beyond what scattered agricultural communities possessed. How does a lone exile accomplish this? The traditional answer is, he doesn't. Not alone. The Book of Jubilees describes the city of Enoch in detail that never made it into Genesis. It speaks of those who descended to instruct, helping to lay out the city according to celestial patterns, aligning its gates with stellar configurations, and teaching the forging of metals for both tools and weapons. But it's the Cave of Treasures, a Syriac Christian text from the 6th century that preserves earlier Semitic traditions, that provides the most explicit account. It describes how the sons of Cain were taught by watchers who had descended to build with stone in ways that would endure floods and earthquakes, to smelt copper and tin into bronze, to forge iron for weapons and tools, to create instruments of music that could move the spirit, to develop written language for recording transactions and laws, and to establish courts and systems of justice independent of tribal or divine authority. This wasn't primitive construction. This was advanced civilization emerging fully formed in a single generation, something impossible without transferred knowledge. The Sumerian king list, one of the oldest historical documents we possess, describes the antediluvian cities as places where kingship descended from heaven. The same language appears in Akkadian texts describing the Apkallu, the 7 sages who brought civilization to humanity before the flood. These sages are depicted in Mesopotamian art as hybrid figures, part human and part divine, often shown with wings or fish-like features. The pattern is unmistakable. Ancient sources across multiple cultures describe the same phenomenon. Advanced civilization didn't evolve gradually from human innovation. It was taught by beings from beyond the human realm. Cain'S city, the first city, was the prototype for this model. A demonstration project where hybrid beings could showcase what became possible when humanity accepted their instruction. A rival to Eden built not on obedience but on knowledge, not on faith but on power. Let's examine specifically what these hybrid beings taught Cain and his descendants, because the details matter. This wasn't just agricultural know-how or basic tool-making. The knowledge transferred was transformative and, according to the texts, explicitly forbidden. The Book of Enoch chapter 8 provides a detailed inventory. Azazel, one of the chief watchers, taught men to make swords, knives, shields, and breastplates, the technology of warfare. Semyaza taught enchantments and root cutting, herbalism, and potentially pharmacology. Armoros taught the resolving of enchantments, perhaps early chemistry or alchemy. Barakegel taught astrology. Kokabel taught the signs and constellations. Ezekiel taught knowledge of the clouds, meteorology. Erekiel taught the signs of the earth, geology. Shamsiel taught the signs of the sun, solar astronomy. But the most significant teacher was Tubal-Cain, described in Genesis 4 verse 22 as an instructor of every artificer in brass and iron. Traditional readings treat him as merely a skilled craftsman, a descendant of Cain. But the extra-biblical texts identify Tubal-Cain as something more. A hybrid being himself, the actual architect of the city, working in partnership with Cain. The Masonic traditions preserve Tubal-Cain as a central figure, the father of metallurgy and sacred architecture. Why would a biblical figure, especially one from the cursed line of Cain, become so venerated in esoteric traditions if he were merely human? Because he wasn't merely human. He was the technical genius behind the first city, possessing knowledge that would take humanity millennia to rediscover after the flood destroyed Cain's civilization. Consider what early metallurgy required: understanding of ore extraction, knowledge of temperature control and furnace design, comprehension of alloy ratios, and mastery of forging techniques. This knowledge doesn't develop spontaneously. It requires systematic experimentation over generations, or direct instruction from beings who already possess it. The same applies to urban planning. Excavations of the earliest cities reveal sophisticated drainage systems, aligned street grids, and monumental architecture that suggests centralized planning and mathematical precision far beyond what tribal societies typically achieve. The hybrid beings brought blueprints, both literal and metaphorical. They transferred information that would allow humanity to leap forward in capability, but at a terrible cost that the texts make clear. This knowledge came with corruption, with violence, with the erosion of the boundaries that were meant to keep humanity within certain limits. But the knowledge transfer was only half of the agenda. The deeper purpose of the hybrid beings' involvement with Cain's city was genetic. Genesis 6 verse 4 states, "There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown." The Hebrew word translated as giants is Nephilim, a term whose etymology has been debated for centuries. The most accepted derivation is from naphal, meaning to fall, suggesting the Nephilim were the fallen ones, or those who cause others to fall. But here's what gets overlooked. The text says the Nephilim existed in those days, and also after that. After what? After the initial descent of the Watchers, yes, but the phrasing suggests ongoing hybridization, not a single event. Cain's city became a laboratory for this ongoing process. The Book of Giants, found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, describes the Nephilim as beings of enormous size and appetite, but also of hybrid nature, part human, part something else. They weren't just physically larger, they possessed abilities that normal humans lacked. The Testament of the 12 Patriarchs preserves a tradition that the Nephilim could manipulate matter, heal or harm with a touch, and perceive things hidden from human senses. This suggests genetic modification that affected not just physical stature but neurological and perhaps spiritual capabilities. Why would the Watchers engage in this hybridization program? The text suggests several motives. First, to create a race of beings who could serve as intermediaries between the divine realm and the human realm, loyal to the Watchers rather than to God. Second, to corrupt the Adamic bloodline, preventing the eventual coming of the promised seed who would crush the serpent's head. Third, to establish permanent physical presence in the material realm through embodied offspring. Cain's city became the epicenter of this program. By allying with Cain, the hybrid beings gained access to the most pure Adamic genetics available outside of Eden, direct descent from Adam through the firstborn son. Every child born in that city would carry both Adamic and Watcher genetics, creating a new race that was neither fully human nor fully angelic. The Zohar refers to this hybridization as the mingling that should not have been, describing it as a corruption not just of flesh but of the spiritual transmission that humanity was meant to carry. The medieval Jewish commentator Rashi, drawing on earlier rabbinic sources, suggests that the Nephilim were sterile after several generations, a built-in limitation to their reproduction that would eventually require renewed intervention from pure Watcher stock. This explains why the texts describe waves of hybridization, not a single event. The genetic program required ongoing maintenance. Cain's city was generation 1. But the pattern would repeat throughout antediluvian history, creating multiple lines of hybrid humans, each with slightly different characteristics, until the flood wiped them all away. Or so the story goes. Let's return to the city itself, because its physical structure encoded a theological and cosmological rebellion that most readers completely miss. Eden was a garden, organic, growing, directly maintained by divine presence. Cain's city was the opposite, angular, artificial, permanent, and self-governing. It was a statement in stone and bronze that humanity didn't need God's garden. They could create their own paradise through knowledge and power. The Book of Jubilees describes the city as having 7 gates, each aligned with a celestial body. This wasn't arbitrary architecture. It was astrotheological planning, creating a physical structure that mirrored the heavens and allowed for precise astronomical observation and calendrical calculation. Why does this matter? Because in the ancient world, controlling the calendar meant controlling society. Knowing when to plant, when to harvest, when to conduct trade, when to make war, all of this depended on accurate timekeeping, which required astronomical knowledge. By teaching Cain to build a city aligned with celestial patterns, the hybrid beings were establishing an authority structure independent of divine revelation. You didn't need God to tell you when to plant. You could calculate it yourself by observing the stars. You didn't need prophetic guidance. You had astronomical precision. This was the deeper rebellion, the replacement of faith with knowledge, of dependence with autonomy, of divine relationship with technical mastery. The Gnostic texts, particularly the Apocryphon of John, describe the archons, rulers of the material realm, teaching humanity to build structures that would trap the spirit in matter. While this is often interpreted metaphorically, there may be a literal component. The architecture itself, oriented to stellar and planetary alignments, may have been designed to anchor spiritual energies in physical form, preventing the ascent of consciousness back toward the divine source. Ancient megalithic structures around the world show similar astronomical alignments. Stonehenge, Göbekli Tepe, the pyramids of Egypt. Were these later attempts to recreate the lost principles first demonstrated in Cain's city? Were they cargo cult reconstructions of antediluvian knowledge, built by descendants who remembered that alignment with the heavens was important but had lost the deeper understanding of why? The city of Enoch, named after Cain's son, became the template for all subsequent human cities. The Sumerian cities, the Egyptian cities, the Indus Valley cities, all show evidence of centralized planning, astronomical alignment, and sophisticated engineering that appears suddenly in the archaeological record without gradual development. This isn't evidence of ancient aliens in the sensationalist sense. It's evidence of knowledge transfer from non-human intelligences to early humans, with Cain's city as the prototype. We must address the mark of Cain, because it's central to understanding why the hybrid beings could work with him safely. Genesis 4 verse 15 states, "And the Lord said unto him, Therefore whosoever slayeth Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord set a mark upon Cain, lest any finding him should kill him." Mainstream interpretation treats this as a simple protective sign. But the apocryphal texts reveal something far more complex and disturbing. The Targum's Pseudo-Jonathan, an Aramaic interpretation of the Torah, describes the mark as a letter from God's own name, placed on Cain's forehead. Which letter? Shin, representing divine power and fire. But inverted or altered in some way that made it recognizable as a mark of judgment rather than blessing. The Clementine Homilies, an early Christian text, describes the mark as giving Cain a trembling that never left him, a visible physical manifestation that marked him as separate from normal humanity. But here's the critical detail that gets lost. The mark wasn't just protective. It was transactional. It prevented anyone from killing Cain, but it also prevented Cain from killing himself. It bound him to physical existence in a way that made him almost immortal, unable to escape his exile through death. This made Cain the perfect long-term partner for the Watchers Project. While other humans aged and died, Cain endured. He could oversee the city's construction not just for years but for centuries. The Book of Jubilees suggests Cain lived for over 700 years, presiding over multiple generations of hybrid descendants. The mark also served another purpose. It prevented divine intervention against him. God had made a covenant. Anyone who harmed Cain would face sevenfold vengeance. This created a protected zone around Cain within which the Watchers could operate without direct divine interference. A cosmic loophole exploited to maximum effect. The rabbinical text Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer suggests that the mark glowed. It was luminous, visible from a distance, announcing Cain's presence. This had the dual effect of warning others away while also serving as a beacon for those who sought him out. The hybrid beings could identify their protected human partner from afar. Now we come to one of the most suppressed aspects of this entire narrative. What happened to the hybrid lineages after the flood? The sanitized biblical version suggests the flood wiped out all the Nephilim and reset humanity through Noah's family. But a careful reading of the text reveals problems with this interpretation. Numbers 13:33 describes the Israelite spies returning from Canaan and reporting, "And there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants, and we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight. Wait, giants? After the flood? The Hebrew term is again Nephilim, the exact same word used in Genesis 6 for the antediluvian hybrids. The book of Enoch addresses this directly. In chapter 10, the text describes the watchers being bound under the hills of the earth until the day of judgment, but their offspring, the Nephilim, are described differently. Their spirits are said to persist, becoming the demons and evil spirits that plague humanity. But certain texts suggest physical survival as well. The Book of Giants describes some Nephilim surviving by retreating into deep caverns and underground networks during the flood. When the waters receded, they emerged, founding new civilizations in Canaan, Anatolia, and beyond. This explains the persistent accounts of giant kings throughout the Old Testament. Og of Bashan, whose bed was 13 feet long. Goliath of Gath and his brothers, one of whom had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, a genetic anomaly that suggests hybrid DNA. The Anakim, the Rephaim, the Emim, all described as remnant populations of unusual size and strength. More disturbingly, the Dead Sea Scrolls include fragments describing the Nephilim teaching their knowledge to chosen human lineages before the flood, creating a mechanism for knowledge preservation even if they didn't physically survive. Who were these chosen lineages? The texts aren't explicit, but they hint at certain tribes and families who preserved forbidden knowledge through the ages, passing it down through mystery schools, secret societies, and esoteric traditions. The Masonic tradition explicitly traces its origins to pre-flood builders, claiming to preserve the architectural and mathematical knowledge of the antediluvian world. The Hermetic traditions claim descent from Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great, who some scholars identify with Enoch, not Cain's son Enoch but the other Enoch, the 7th from Adam, who walked with God and was taken up without dying. But there's another Enochian tradition that gets less attention, the possibility that Cain's city, Enoch, preserved knowledge through the flood via deliberately hidden repositories. The Testament of Cain describes pillars of wisdom erected in the city, inscribed with all the knowledge the Watchers had taught, designed to survive water and fire. Were these pillars purely legendary, or do they represent a memory of actual knowledge preservation? And if knowledge survived, what about genetics? Once you see the pattern in Cain's story, you begin seeing it everywhere in ancient history. Nimrod building the Tower of Babel, another project of human ambition aided by suspicious knowledge, ending in divine intervention to scatter humanity. The Egyptian dynasties, which appear suddenly with advanced mathematics, architecture, and astronomy, claiming descent from gods who ruled before the human pharaohs. The Sumerian civilization, which describes the Anunnaki as the source of all knowledge and kingship, and depicts them as beings who descended from the heavens. The Hindu Vedas describe the Asuras, powerful beings who taught humans technology and magic but were ultimately at war with the Devas, the gods. The Greek Titans, imprisoned beneath the earth, who gave humanity fire and knowledge through Prometheus. The Mesoamerican legends of Quetzalcoatl and Kukulkan, divine teachers who brought civilization, then departed with promises to return. Every culture has a version of this story. Advanced beings interact with early humans, transfer transformative knowledge, enable the rapid development of civilization, and then either depart or are defeated/imprisoned by higher divine powers. Cain's city is the prototype for all of these narratives. It's the original demonstration of what happens when humans accept instruction from entities outside the divine order. Rapid technological advancement, increased human power, but also corruption, violence, and eventual destruction. The pattern is so consistent that it can't be coincidental. Either these are cultural memories of actual events, a worldwide phenomenon of contact with non-human intelligences in deep antiquity, or there's something in the human psyche that generates this narrative structure independently across disconnected cultures. The esoteric traditions lean toward the first interpretation. They suggest that the hybrid beings and their human partners didn't disappear. They went underground, literally and figuratively, preserving their knowledge and bloodlines through secret channels, emerging periodically to guide human development in directions that served their agenda. Every major leap in human civilization, from the Renaissance to the Industrial Revolution to the current technological age, can be examined through this lens. Are we innovating or are we remembering? Are we discovering or are we being taught once again by entities who never really left? Now we must address the crucial question. If this narrative is present in so many ancient texts, why was it systematically excluded from the canonical Bible? The answer reveals the political and theological forces that shaped what became Orthodox Christianity. When the early church councils met to determine which texts would be included in the official canon, they faced a crisis of interpretation. The Book of Enoch was widely read and respected in the first centuries of Christianity. The New Testament letter of Jude explicitly quotes from it, lending it apostolic authority. Yet it was ultimately excluded from most Christian Bibles. Why? Because its implications were theologically destabilizing. If non-human entities could so easily deceive and corrupt humanity, what did that say about human free will and moral responsibility? If hybrid beings existed who were neither human nor demon in the traditional sense, how did they fit into the simple dichotomy of saved and damned? If advanced knowledge was available outside of divine revelation, what was the Church's role as sole intermediary between God and humanity? The Enochian narrative threatened the Church's authority structure. It suggested that divine knowledge wasn't the only kind of knowledge, and that power could be accessed through means other than sanctioned religious channels. So it was suppressed. Not eliminated entirely. That would have been impossible given how widely distributed these texts were, but marginalized. Labeled as apocryphal, which literally means hidden, but came to mean unreliable or heretical. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, more isolated from the political pressures of Rome and Constantinople, kept the Book of Enoch in its canon. The Qumran community, which produced the Dead Sea Scrolls, clearly valued Enochian literature highly, preserving multiple copies. But mainstream Christianity, Judaism, and eventually Islam all moved away from these texts, creating a simplified narrative that was easier to control and teach. The result is what most people believe today. Cain killed Abel, was exiled, somehow built a city, and that's that. No watchers. No hybrids. No transfer of forbidden knowledge. Just a vague story about the first murder and its consequences. But the texts that preserve the fuller narrative still exist. They're available. They've been available for centuries, and with modern translations and the discovery of additional manuscripts like the Dead Sea Scrolls, they're more accessible than ever. The question isn't whether these texts exist. It's whether we have the courage to take them seriously and consider what they reveal about our actual history versus the sanitized version we've been taught. Let's bring this into the present day because this isn't just ancient history. The patterns described in these texts are allegedly recurring now. Reports of non-human intelligence interacting with humanity haven't stopped. They've simply changed form. From medieval accounts of angels and demons to modern reports of UFO encounters and alien contact, the narrative structure remains remarkably consistent. Beings of superior knowledge and technology offering to share their capabilities with humans in exchange for, what exactly? The abduction phenomenon, extensively documented since the 1960s, includes consistent reports of genetic experimentation, hybrid breeding programs where human DNA is combined with something else. The abductees describe beings who are conducting multi-generational projects, tracking bloodlines, creating hybrid offspring who are neither fully human nor fully other. Sound familiar? It's the Watcher program updated for the modern era. Whether you interpret these accounts literally or symbolically, the pattern persists. Advanced knowledge is being offered to humanity, but it comes with strings attached. It comes with corruption, with loss of autonomy, with the erosion of boundaries that were established for our protection. The technological explosion of the last century, nuclear power, genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, transhumanism, represents capabilities that are rapidly exceeding our wisdom to use them responsibly. We're gaining godlike powers without godlike understanding. We're modifying our own genetics, creating artificial intelligence that may soon exceed human intelligence, and developing technologies that could end or radically transform human existence. Are we innovating these things ourselves, or are we being guided toward them by intelligences who understand the endpoint better than we do? Are we approaching a new level of human capability, or are we repeating Cain's error on a global scale, accepting instruction from entities whose agenda isn't aligned with our long-term welfare? The esoteric traditions suggest that the same forces that worked with Cain are still active, still teaching, still hybridizing, still building toward an endpoint that won't be in humanity's best interest. They point to the proliferation of secret societies, occult orders, and elite groups that claim access to special knowledge unavailable to the masses, knowledge that supposedly will enable them to transcend normal human limitations. This is the Watcher Promise updated. Join us. Receive our knowledge. Become more than human. What could go wrong? Everything. Everything could go wrong just as it did in Cain's day. So what do we do with this knowledge? First, we recognize that the simplified version of history we've been taught is inadequate. The biblical narrative, even in its canonical form, hints at complexities that mainstream interpretation glosses over or ignores entirely. The apocryphal texts fill in those gaps, providing context that makes the canonical text more, not less, coherent. Second, we understand that the pattern of forbidden knowledge transfer, beings offering to elevate humanity through information and technology, is recurring, not historical curiosity. It's happening now in forms we might not immediately recognize because we've been trained to dismiss the ancient accounts as mythology rather than encoded warnings. Third, we reclaim our discernment. Not every source of knowledge is benevolent. Not every offer of advancement serves our actual interests. The Watchers offered real knowledge, metallurgy, astronomy, herbalism, architecture, but that knowledge came packaged with corruption and enslavement. Today's offerings are similar: genetic modification, cognitive enhancement, life extension, artificial intelligence. All real capabilities, all potentially beneficial, but all carrying risks that exceed the benefits if we accept them without understanding who's really offering them and what their endgame is. The story of Cain's city is a warning encoded in our most ancient texts. It tells us that the first human civilization wasn't built through gradual human innovation. It was jump-started by entities with their own agenda, creating a model of human society based on power and knowledge rather than relationship with the divine. That civilization was destroyed in the flood, or so the texts tell us. But the knowledge survived. The bloodlines survived. And the pattern continues. We're living in another iteration of Cain's city, a global civilization built on technology that arrived too fast, knowledge that seems to come from nowhere, and promises of transcendence that sound eerily similar to the serpent's promise in Eden: ye shall be as gods. But here's the redemptive message buried in these texts. We don't have to accept the offering. We can choose the harder path of gradual, earned wisdom over rapid, gifted knowledge. We can build societies based on organic development rather than imported templates. We can refuse the hybrid path and maintain our humanity, flawed as it is, rather than trade it for enhanced capabilities that come with strings attached. This is the choice that's been presented to humanity since Cain walked into Nod and met the beings waiting there. It's the choice that's been encoded in every mystery tradition, every esoteric teaching, every secret society initiation. Will you accept knowledge from those who shouldn't be teaching you? Will you ally with powers that offer advancement at the cost of your autonomy? Cain said yes. And in doing so, he built the first city, fathered hybrid children, and established a pattern that would corrupt humanity so thoroughly that divine intervention through the flood became necessary. We stand at a similar threshold now. The beings are still offering. The knowledge is still flowing. The hybridization programs continue under different names. But we know the story now. We know how it ends. and knowing that we can choose differently. This is Godwin Scrolls, and we don't just expose hidden history, we equip you to understand it and apply it. If this information resonates with you, if you feel the weight of these revelations, then you're ready for more. Subscribe to this channel and activate notifications, because we're just beginning to pull back the veil on the knowledge they've hidden from you. In upcoming episodes, we'll explore the exact identity of the Watchers and their current operations, the hidden bloodlines that trace back to the Nephilim and where they are today, the secret knowledge preserved through mystery schools across millennia, the technological artifacts that shouldn't exist according to mainstream archaeology, the prophecies describing what happens when the hybrids return in force. These aren't conspiracy theories. These are conspiracy facts, preserved in texts that predate the canonical Bible, validated by archaeological discoveries, and confirmed by patterns that persist into the modern era. Comment below with your insights. What stood out to you about Cain's story? Have you encountered the pattern of forbidden knowledge in your own research? Are there specific aspects of this narrative you want us to explore more deeply? Share this video with anyone who's ready to see beyond the sanitized version of history they've been taught. This information is too important to keep hidden. And remember, the truth has always been available. It's just been hidden in plain sight, waiting for those with eyes to see and ears to hear. The hybrid beings helped Cain build the first city. They've been building with us ever since. But now you know their history. Now you know the pattern. And knowledge, true knowledge, is the first step toward freedom. This is Godwin Scrolls. Stay vigilant. Stay informed. Stay human.